let's dive deep into James Monroe. You want more than the usual textbook stuff about the fifth president, right?
Oh,
And we got all your sources right here, ready to explore. He's often called the last of the founding fathers, which is pretty interesting. But what I really want to understand is how he dealt with, well, a young nation, facing things like slavery and westward expansion.
oh, that's a great place to start. Yeah, Monroe's life really shows those contradictions.
Right.
Born in 1758 in Virginia, his family both benefited from and relied on, well, enslaved labor, but then he becomes this champion of liberty.
Like, how did he square those two things?
Exactly.
So let's get into it. Sources talk about his early life in Westmoreland County, Virginia. Prosperous family, but slave owning, like you said. I can already see how complicated this is going to get.
For sure.
And then both his parents died before he turned 16.
Yeah, which is when his uncle, Joseph Jones, comes in. He kind of guides him toward education.
At the College of William and Mary.
Right. You can imagine how those conversations shaped him, especially with the revolution brewing.
And then, bam, 1776, the revolution hits. Monroe leaves school, joins the Continental Army. He even fought and was wounded at the Battle of Trenton.
That's got to be a defining moment, right?
Really.
To see a nation being born, those ideals of liberty forged in war.
It wasn't just some idea for him, it was real.
Exactly.
And then there's his relationship with Thomas Jefferson. Imagine studying law under a giant like that, building a lifelong friendship. That had to influence his political thinking.
Oh, absolutely. They were close. They even lived near each other. Monroe's estate, Highland, was near Jefferson's Monticello. It's really interesting to think about how their talks might have shaped Monroe's approach to, well, governing.
It is, but here's where it gets tricky. We know Monroe was all about liberty, but he also owned a plantation.
That relied on enslaved labor.
Right. How do we make sense of that?
I mean, instead of just calling him a hypocrite, maybe we should think about how he justified it back then. Was he grappling with the morality of it, or was it just the accepted norm that he didn't really question?
It's a tough one.
It is. It's hard to judge people from the past by today's standards.
Right.
We need to understand the context, the social and economic forces, without, condoning or condemning.
For sure. Okay, moving on from that. Our sources highlight Monroe's rise in politics. Virginia General Assembly, U.S. Senate, even governor of Virginia.
He was a man on the move.
Definitely. And it wasn't just domestic stuff. He had these big diplomatic roles in France, Britain, Spain.
During huge upheaval in Europe, no less. Imagine the skills he needed to navigate that.
Oh, I'm especially struck by his part in the Louisiana Purchase in 1803,
Oh, yeah.
doubling the size of the U.S. for like $15 million.
That alone makes him a historical figure, and not just for the land and money, but for its impact on, America's sense of itself. It fueled that manifest destiny idea, and that had huge consequences.
Absolutely. Okay, so then his presidency starts in 1817. The era of good feelings, they called it.
Right.
Unity, economic prosperity after the War of 1812. Sounds pretty ideal.
Yeah, but maybe a little too simple. I mean, there was optimism, but the seeds of the Civil War were already there. It was kind of a fragile facade.
I see.
Definitely.
Okay, I want to learn more about that. The sources mention him trying to heal the country after the War of 1812, that nationwide tour, trying to build goodwill.
He was really aware of how delicate things were.
He was.
Walking a tightrope between different interests and ideas. His presidency is like a turning point, this time of progress and rising tension.
And then the Missouri Compromise in 1820.
Oh, yeah.
That really shows how much tension there was over slavery.
Absolutely. Missouri wanted to join as a slave state. The whole slavery debate exploded.
It did.
The compromise let Missouri in as a slave state, Maine as a free state. It kept the balance in the Senate.
But it was just a temporary solution, right?
Yeah.
They drew that line across the Louisiana Territory. No slavery north of it except for Missouri, of course. It was bound to blow up eventually.
It was. It just delayed the inevitable fight over slavery.
Right.
Shows how divided the nation was already. It's interesting to think about how Monroe, who wanted unity, dealt with that compromise.
It is. Speaking of lasting impacts, there's the Monroe Doctrine,
Oh, right.
basically telling Europe, hands off the Americas, no more colonies.
A huge moment for American foreign policy. It said, we're in charge here, and its influence is still felt today.
Amazing how one document can do that.
It is.
But let's not forget about the man himself. After his presidency, Monroe goes back to Highland. But our sources say he had money problems later in life.
Yeah. It reminds us that even the greats have struggles. It makes him more human.
Right.
He wasn't just a name in a book.
He's a complicated guy, full of contradictions, leading a nation on the verge of huge change.
He was.
Before we get more into his legacy, did our sources find any interesting, maybe lighter stuff about Monroe? Something to surprise our listener?
Actually, yeah. Besides, the powdered wigs we talked about.
Right.
There's something else. You ever notice how Monroe on the $2 bill, how he's got this glint in his eye?
Now that you mention it, yeah. He's like, in on a secret.
Maybe it's the weight of history, the last of the founding fathers.
Right.
Or maybe it's just the artist. But it adds a little mystery to him.
It does. Okay. We've covered a lot. The Louisiana Purchase and what it meant for Native Americans.
Right.
Sectionalism, rising, a glimpse into his personal life.
We've seen how his vision for a continental nation, took shape.
Right.
And how he dealt with the tough ethical questions tied to his legacy. But we're not done yet.
We're not. In the next part, we'll go deeper into his legacy.
Right.
And see what lessons we can learn from him, from his time.
Definitely. Stay tuned. We're going deeper into the life of this fascinating and important figure.
We are. So we're talking about the Louisiana Purchase, a huge win for the U.S., but it makes you think about the Native American tribes.
Yeah.
It wasn't exactly empty land, was it?
Yeah, good point. While Americans were celebrating, for Native Americans, it meant being pushed off their land.
Right.
And a lot of those treaties, well, they were more about force than fairness.
Our sources mentioned the Indian Removal Act of 1830.
Right.
That was under Andrew Jackson, right?
Yeah.
Was that already in motion during Monroe's time?
Oh, absolutely. Manifest destiny, that idea that America was meant to expand westward, it really took off then. And it's tied to what happened to Native Americans.
So even though Monroe didn't force removals like Jackson, his policies kind of set the stage.
Exactly. He wanted a nation that spanned the continent. That vision shaped America, but it came at a huge cost.
It shows how progress can have, well, bad consequences. It makes you think about history and the people who shaped it.
Definitely. We have to see both the good and the bad,
Yeah.
Understand how things from the past still affect us today.
Okay. Shifting gears a bit. Our sources say that during Monroe's presidency, new political groups started forming. And sectionalism was growing. I thought the era of good feelings meant everyone was united.
It's funny, right? Underneath that unity, there were cracks, especially slavery. It was dividing the North and South.
So you had different economies, different ways of life, different views on slavery, basically two different ideas of what America should be.
Exactly. And as those tensions grew, they needed strong leadership.
They did.
But Monroe's successors would have an even tougher time keeping the country together.
It's like Monroe was leading a nation on the edge. He kept things calm, but it was ready to explode.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. It shows how hard it is to govern during big changes.
Okay, we've talked a lot about Monroe's public life. But what about him personally? What did the sources say about that?
Well, we know he was married to Elizabeth Courtwright.
Right.
They had 3 kids, and like you said, he had money troubles later on.
It reminds you that behind all the titles and achievements, there are people with families, with struggles.
It does.
They weren't just names in a book.
It adds another layer, helps us connect with them.
So as we look at Monroe's legacy, we need to remember both the big picture and the small details.
Exactly. And when we look closer, we see someone shaped by his time, but also shaping it.
Before we finish up this part, I have to ask, did the sources find any, fun facts about Monroe?
Well, besides his love of powdered wigs, which we've covered,
Right.
there's something else. Have you noticed how in his portrait on the $2 bill, Monroe has this mischievous look in his eye?
Oh, yeah. Like he knows something we don't.
Maybe it's the weight of history, being the last of the founding fathers.
Yeah.
Or maybe it's just the artist, but it makes it more interesting.
It does. Okay, we've talked about a lot.
Yeah.
The Louisiana Purchase, Native Americans,
Right.
sectionalism, Monroe's personal life.
We've seen his vision for a continental America, how it all played out,
We have.
and how he dealt with the ethical questions, tied to his legacy.
Right.
But there's still more to explore.
There is. In the last part, we'll really get into his legacy and what we can learn from him, from his time. Welcome back to our deep dive on James Monroe. We've gone through his life, from revolution to presidency, all the ups and downs. And now, as we wrap things up, I'm thinking, what can we learn from him today? History isn't just about the past, right?
You got it. Understanding the past can help us now, maybe even build a better future. So, with James Monroe, what really stands out?
Well, his dedication to public service, wow. He spent his life building a stronger nation. Soldier, diplomat, president. That's powerful, especially these days when it feels like everyone's just looking out for themselves.
It is. He reminds us that leadership isn't about, getting ahead. It's about working for everyone. That's always relevant.
Definitely. And his ability to handle, like, really tough political situations.
Yeah.
He kept the country together, even with all that sectionalism.
Yeah.
Sure, the compromise didn't last, but still.
It shows his skills, his commitment to finding common ground. And even though we face different issues now, those skills are still so important.
They are. His foreign policy, too. The Monroe Doctrine, even with all the debate around it, it shows how important it is to set boundaries, to stand up for your interests.
Yeah, it was a big statement back then. And it shaped American foreign policy for a long time. It shows that even smaller nations can make a difference.
Absolutely. And of course, there's westward expansion. We've talked about the impact on Native Americans. But it's clear that Monroe's vision was huge in making the U.S. a continental power.
Yeah, it reminds us that progress isn't always good. We have to think about the ethical side of things, especially with land and how we treat Native peoples. That's still a conversation today.
It is. So at the end of this deep dive, we see James Monroe as, well, a man of contradictions.
Right.
A leader who represents both the good and the bad of his time. But most of all, someone who shaped America in a big way.
His story shows how much individuals can do, the importance of compromise and diplomacy,
Right.
and how hard it is to balance growth with doing the right thing.
It is. I hope you've gotten to know James Monroe better. Not just as a name, but as a real person who was so important to American history.
Yeah, history is a conversation that keeps going. Keep learning about Monroe, decide what you think about him, what his story means to you.
And maybe, in doing that, you'll find lessons that apply to your own life, your own view of the world. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into James Monroe.